to this video lecture series for ethics. In this video, we continue our discussion of the principle of equality. In our previous video, we applied the principle of equality to the issue of charitable giving. And what we saw through Peter Singer's argument in Famine, Affluence, and Morality is that he thinks we have an obligation to help those who are suffering, who are also in a position to help, regardless of how close they are to us, regardless of whether we know them, regardless of whether we have any personal connection with them. That is the basis of the principle of equality. It's the idea that we have to take everybody's interests into account, no matter what their certain circumstances, and no matter what their relation to us in particular is. In this video, we're going to apply the principle of equality to a second practical issue, and that is the treatment of non-human animals. And again, we're going to do this by looking at another well-known work from the contemporary utilitarian Peter Singer, an excerpt from his famous book, Animal Liberation. Now, as a way of entering into this topic, we should recall that in utilitarianism, Mill already established that there does seem to be a connection between the principle of equality and our treatment of non-humans. So, for instance, he says here that the principle of equality in utilitarianism says that to the greatest extent possible, we should secure the happiness of all mankind. So we have to, of course, worry about all human beings, but he doesn't stop there. He says, and not to them only, but so far as the nature of things admits, to the whole sentient creation. So if what really matters, if what a happy life is a life that has the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain, then that means every being that can feel pleasure and pain should matter from a moral point of view. And because non-humans can feel pleasure and pain, a wide variety of species can feel pleasure and pain to a wide variety of degrees, it only makes sense that on a utilitarian view, we would have to take them into account. And if it's happiness and pleasure and pain that matters, then it doesn't really matter if that pleasure and pain is being felt in a human body or the body of a cow or a chicken or a pig or a dog or a cat. All that matters is that we increase the happiness to the greatest extent possible and decrease suffering. Now this again is a respect in which the utilitarian moral theory, although being seemingly simple in its initial statement, does have some radical consequences. And we can see this if we think about what I would call the traditional view of animal ethics. And to see this traditional view, I want to look at some statements from a couple of philosophers, specifically St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, who very much take a view of our treatment of non-human animals that is opposite of the ones that the utilitarians generally would advocate. So here is St. Augustine. He says, "We can perceive by their cries that animals die in pain. Although we make little of this, since the beast, lacking a rational soul, is not related to us by a common nature." Now, this is actually a striking statement for someone to make, because, imagine you were saying this about another human being. You said, look, that human being is suffering, that human being I can see is in great pain, but it makes no difference to me because I don't see myself related to that individual. I don't see myself as having a connection with that individual. So therefore, from my point of view, their suffering doesn't matter. Now, were you to say that about another human being, we would call you inhuman, and depending on what was the reason you didn't find yourself having connection with that person, we might say you were discriminatory. But notice this is essentially what Augustine is saying about non-human animals. He admits that they suffer, he admits they feel pain, he admits that things can go well or go poorly for them. But because he says animals lack this rational soul, they're not like us. And because they're not like us, we apparently don't have to worry about their interests. As we're going to see, this exact attitude is the basis for Peter Singer's claim in Animal Liberation that what he calls speciesism, a discrimination against other species, is similar to the moral evil that we find in sexism and racism. All of it is a form of unjust discrimination. Now let's also look at another justification for what I might call the traditional view of animal ethics. So here's St. Thomas Aquinas. And here he's discussing the fact that there are passages in the Bible that he says forbid us to be cruel to animals. Right? And he says, well, why is this? Well, here's the justification, he says, for why although animals are not as important as human beings, we should not be cruel to them. He says, it is either to remove men's thoughts from being cruel to other men, or lest through being cruel to animals one becomes cruel to other human beings, or because injury of an animal leads to the temporal hurt of man. So what is he saying here? He's saying, well, the Bible sometimes tells us to not be cruel to animals. Why is that? Because if we are cruel to animals, it'll be more likely that we'll be cruel to other human beings. And that might be true. I mean, it's an empirical question, but it doesn't strike me as absurd that someone who's cruel to an animal might also be cruel to a human being. But notice what this shows about his conception of, do the interests of animals matter? He's saying, no, it's not the animal itself that you're being cruel to that matters. The reason it's wrong to be cruel to another animal is because that might make you a more dangerous, more harmful person to other humans. Humans are the only ones that matter, and it's important we don't corrupt ourselves and make ourselves more likely to harm humans. But the interests of animals just do not matter, although they can feel pain, although they can suffer. So in both of these thinkers, they're making somewhat different points, but they're getting at the same fundamental idea, that there's something special, there's something unique about human beings that is such that makes them the sole individuals that actually warrant moral consideration. And of course, we can see this if we think about all the ways in which we commonly treat non-human animals. We, of course, eat them. We hunt them for fun or for sport. We might put their skins up on our walls. We might go to zoos to see them in captivity. And these are just commonly accepted ways of treating animals. And of course, you would never imagine that it would be acceptable to treat a human being in any of those ways. So the point here is that there's this traditional idea that humans have a special importance above non-human animals. But in this lesson, we're going to look at Peter Stenger's thoughts and how he questions whether that should actually be the case. And as we're going to see, his idea is based on thinking more clearly and more deeply about, what does the idea of equality mean? What does it mean when we say human beings are equal? And if we think human beings are equal, then based on the reason we think that, does that also show we should see animals as moral equals as well? Now, before we get into this argument, we should examine a few of the statements that Stenger makes in this selection from his book, Animal Liberation. He admits at the time when he's writing this in the 70s that the idea of animal liberation and the idea which he holds that animals, like women, like African Americans, for instance, needed a civil rights movement, that animals need a civil rights movement as well, is going to strike people as being very odd. So in the first sentence here he says, animal liberation may sound more like a parody of other liberation movements than a serious objective. And in a 2015 interview, much more recent, he again explicitly connects the way we treat animals to unjust treatment based on racism and sexism. Stenger says, although it is true, of course, that we have not overcome racism, sexism, or discrimination against people with disabilities, there is at least widespread acceptance that such discrimination is wrong, and there are laws that seek to prevent it. With what he calls speciesism, we're very far from reaching that point. If we were to compare attitudes about speciesism today with past racist attitudes, we would have to say that we are back in the days in which the slave trade was still legal, although under challenge by some enlightened voices. And if you accept that there is a problem here with treating animals unjustly and unequally, then the comparison holds some water. Because, of course, we do keep animals in activity. In factory farms, animals are subjected to extremely harsh treatment before being killed and then served to us as food. And so he sees a parallel here. But in order for this parallel to work, we need some reason to think that the same sort of equality that we think all human beings should share should also be shared by animals. Now, to make this point, he actually begins by using a historical example. And it's a historical example of a feminist philosopher named Mary Wollstonecraft. She's often seen as maybe the first feminist philosopher. And when she was writing in the 18th century, she was, of course, in a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, arguing for equal rights for women in society. For instance, the equal right to vote or equal right for education, etc. And so, of course, you can see her making statements of the following sort in that book. There must be more equality established in society between the sexes, or morality will never gain ground. Right, so she's saying, look, to this point, although this is not entirely true, but to this point we have this idea that all men are equal, meaning all human males. But shouldn't the same basis, the same reason that you think that two males deserve equal rights, shouldn't the same reasons that they deserve equal rights also be extended to women? So Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th century is arguing that we should see men and women as equal just as we see all men as being equal. Now, what's interesting is that there was another thinker at the time, Thomas Taylor, who wrote a book, A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes. One thing you might notice here is the similarity in the titles between Wollstonecraft's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and Taylor's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes. What Taylor did in this book, and Singer talks about this, is he wrote a parody of Wollstonecraft's arguments. And to sum up the parody, it was essentially this. He wrote a book arguing that just like men and women should be equal, so human beings and animals should be equal. Taylor made the point that all the same reasons that Wollstonecraft is giving for why men and women should be equal would also apply to human beings and non-human animals. Now, of course, at the time in the 18th century when Taylor was writing this, he was trying to make the following point. He was trying to say, well, it's absurd to think that animals could be equal to human beings, therefore women shouldn't be equal to men. That was Taylor's point. Now, interestingly, there's one point on which Singer agrees with Taylor. He does agree that the same reasons we have for extending equality from men to women, we also have for extending equality from humans to animals. Where he disagrees with Taylor is he thinks there's nothing absurd about this. Of course, Singer thinks men and women should be equal, and he thinks the exact same reasons will show that humans and animals should be equal. So interestingly, Singer sees this sort of general progressive bent of equality, where once we continually discover in each generation what it means fundamentally for two beings to be equal, we'll see that we have to extend the scope of equality, the scope of moral consideration, farther than we had before. And now he thinks it's the turn of non-human animals. Okay, so to this point, we've really been focusing on this idea. I've told you many times that he bases this argument on the idea of equality. And so to get into Singer's argument, we need to think a little further about what does it mean when we say two individuals are equal. Now, to get at this, I want to begin with the following very famous statement of equality found in the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson famously says the following: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, for our purposes, I'm going to focus on this first part of the statement. This claim, there's a couple things I want to focus on. First, this claim that all men are created equal. Now, of course, we know at the time this was written, this statement was not even close to being fully realized. Africans were being held as slaves, women did not have the right to vote, right? And really what all men are created equal meant practically at the time was that all white property-owning males were equal within society. So the actual society came nowhere close to living up to this ideal. But still to this day, we point to this ideal, this statement that all men are created equal, and we see this as something to strive for and live up to. And when we cite it today, we're not talking about we're not striving, or we don't want to realize a society where only white property-owning males are equal. What we see in that statement is this idea that all human beings are created equal, that all human beings have equal rights. And if we think that's an important idea, it really is striking, I think, that Jefferson says it is self-evident that all human beings are equal. Now, what does self-evident mean? Well, self-evident just means it's obvious, its evidence comes from itself, you don't need to argue for it. So if we put these two claims together, what it's saying is that it is rather obvious that all human beings are equal. Now, when I hear that, in fact, my first reaction is, well, actually that's not necessarily so obvious at at all, depending on what you mean by equality. Because in fact, if I think about human beings, I can think about all sorts of ways in which human beings are not equal to each other. Some are faster, some are slower. Some are more intelligent, some are less intelligent. Some are more artistic, some are less artistic. Some are more emotionally responsive, some are less. Some are more creative, some are less creative. And you could go on and on and on. There's all sorts of ways, from superficial physical characteristics to our mental abilities, to our physical abilities. There's all sorts of ways in which the human population, the human species, is quite diverse. And in fact, if you take a close look at the human species, you wouldn't initially say that all human beings are equal. You would say human beings exhibit a wide array of different abilities over a wide array of different dimensions. Now, we all accept that this is true. It's just patently obvious from observation. So it should make us question, what does Jefferson mean when he says that the equality of all human beings is self-evident? How can the equality of all human beings be self-evident and obvious if we see so much difference within the human population? In fact, we actually see Singer appealing to just this idea. So in one of the passages he writes, "Those who wish to defend hierarchical, inegalitarian societies have often pointed out that by whatever test we choose, it simply is not true that all human beings are equal. Like it or not, we must face the fact that humans come in different shapes and sizes. They come with different moral capacities, intellectual abilities, different amounts of benevolent feeling and sensitivity to the needs of others, different abilities to communicate effectively, and different capacities to experience pleasure and pain." So everyone who wants to argue that we should not live in an equal society, that people should not have equal rights, the first thing they point to is that it's actually not self-evident that human beings are equal. They point to the fact that human beings have different abilities and exhibit a diverse range of capabilities. So the question is that actually a threat to the kind of equality we're interested in? And here's another way to think about this. So think about, these statements are from the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration says the following. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Article 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, like race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national, social origin, property, birth, or other status. What is the Declaration of Human Rights saying? It is saying that all human beings, just in virtue of being human, have these rights. Now, suppose someone wanted to argue against this declaration and said, how can everyone have equal rights? Not everyone is the same. Some people are smarter, some people are stronger, some people are faster, some people are more creative. Why do we all get the same rights? And so the question to think about here is this. Does that criticism hold any water? When we're thinking about a sort of equality like the equality of equal human rights, does it matter that we're not all actually the same in our abilities? Now, to understand this further, we have to draw a distinction. We have to draw a distinction between two different kinds of equality. And I'll call these factual equality and moral equality. And the reason I bring this up is because the question we need to think about is, in that statement that all men are created equal, is that talking about factual equality or moral equality? So first, what is factual equality? Two individuals, X and Y, are factually equal if X and Y have exactly the same capacities and abilities, like intelligence, strength, creativity, and emotional responsiveness. And of course, the thing to say is that if that statement, all men are created equal, is referring to factual equality, then in fact, all men are not created equal. It's actually not true, because as we just said, we all have different abilities. But maybe there's another sense, a different sense of equality that statement is talking about. Perhaps it's talking about moral equality. Two individuals, X and Y, are morally equal if X and Y deserve to have equal consideration of their interests. When we say that two individuals are morally equal, we just say that they're equal in the sense that their lives matter, that their interests matter, that their well-being matters. That when we make a decision, we have to take their interests into account in the same way. And so the point of this is that statement, all men are created equal, It's definitely not self-evidently true if it means factual equality. In fact, it's self-evidently false. But maybe it could be self-evidently true if we say we're talking about moral equality. Perhaps when Jefferson says that all men are created equal, he's not making a statement that all human beings are the same. He's making a statement that all human beings matter. And while when that statement was made, certainly it was not lived up to, or it was not even close to being lived up to, the ideal behind it is that all human beings should have equal rights, all human beings matter, even though we're all different, even though we look different, even though we enjoy different things and we have different abilities. There's a sense in which all human beings matter despite that fact. Now, this is a crucial distinction for Singer's argument, because he thinks once we understand that what we're talking about is moral equality, it's going to be very difficult to simply say that animals can't be equal because they're factually different. And to make this point, he says, okay, well, here's one reason why we should think that equality refers to moral equality, not factual equality. He imagines the following scenario. He imagines someone who proposes that, say, the interest of all those with IQ scores below 100 be given less consideration than the interest of those with ratings over 100. Perhaps those scoring below the mark would, in this society, be made the slaves of those scoring higher. So here's the hypothetical scenario he imagines. He says, let's say in human society we said, everyone above IQ level of 100, you get to be the masters, you get to have rights, and everyone below the IQ level of 100, you get to be the slaves. So, if someone were suggesting this, and the way they would justify it would be in terms of factual inequality. They'd say, look, the group that has a higher level of intelligence, right, an IQ over 100, they deserve to rule, everyone else deserves to be subjects. But of course, this offends against our notions of equality. This seems like an evil society. In fact, we have intuitions that no human person should be a slave. No human person should be owned. It's a horrible moral evil. And what is it that lets us say it's a horrible moral evil? It is simply because we have this idea that people can be morally equal even if they are factually different. And that's the key. The key, again, is the claim that human beings can be morally equal even if they're factually different. And it's this idea that we all want to accept if we want a more fair, just, and equal society. So what does this have to do with the treatment of non-human animals? Well, I think Singer sums up very well in the following passage. He says, if possessing a higher degree of intelligence does not entitle one human to use another for his or her ends, how can it entitle humans to exploit non-humans for that same purpose? Think about the most common justification given for why human beings should be able to rule over and even mistreat non-human animals. It's often said that human beings have the ability to reason, we have greater intelligence, we're smarter. In fact, we saw something similar in Augustine's statement when he said that non-human animals lack a rational soul. And you might think about that and say, well, wait a minute, we just rejected that explanation previously. Above, we said the fact that a human being has a higher IQ score or is more intelligent than another human being doesn't give them the right to own or mistreat or rule over that other human being. Just because I might be smarter than someone else or someone else might be smarter than me, that doesn't give me the right to exploit them and mistreat them. So the point is, when we think about human-to-human relationships, we say humans are factually unequal, but they're morally equal. But then shouldn't the same thing hold for humans and animals? Sure, they're factually unequal. Dogs are not as smart as us. No animal has the sort of rational thinking capacities that the human being does. But why should that matter? Shouldn't they also be considered to be moral equals? If being factually unequal doesn't stop humans from being morally equal, then why should it stop animals from being morally equal as well? So the point is this: you can spend all day, in Singer's view, pointing out the various ways in which humans and animals are different. But none of that is ever going to justify us in killing and eating animals. None of that's going to justify in us in owning animals, in mistreating them in all sorts of various ways. Because what matters at the end of the day is, do they have interests or not? And if they have the ability to suffer, if they have the ability to feel pleasure, then when making moral decisions, we have to take them into account. And we can't simply say they don't matter simply because they don't have the same factual abilities as we human beings do. Now, you'll recall earlier I said that Singer coins this term speciesism, and he sees speciesism as analogous to the unjust treatment that's involved with racism and sexism. And it's on this very basis that the idea of speciesism rests. So he tells us, it is on this basis that the case against racism and the case against sexism must both ultimately rest. And it is in accordance with this principle that the attitude we may call speciesism, by analogy with racism, must be condemned. What is speciesism? It's just a prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. So what ties sexism, racism, and speciesism together isn't just that there's differential treatment, but it's differential treatment and discrimination based on morally irrelevant considerations. It's a prejudice, right? So yes, there's all sorts of ways in which animals are not the same as human beings. There are ways in which men are not the same as women. There are ways in which people of different races have superficial physical characteristics that are different. There are factual differences between different individuals of different sexes or races or species. That's all true. However, that doesn't justify mistreating individuals or beings who are not in your own group. The mere fact that animals can't reason or think in the way we can, the mere fact that animals are not as intelligent as human beings doesn't justify not granting them the same consideration we would give to any other being that can suffer or feel pleasure. So the fundamental moral evil behind speciesism is the same one that's behind sexism and racism. It's differential treatment, it's unjust and unfair treatment on the basis of characteristics that are morally irrelevant. It's a failure to grant moral equality where that moral equality should be present. And finally, I want to conclude by just drawing one further connection with this idea and between utilitarianism. So, I said a number of times, what matters here is that animals can suffer, that they can feel pleasure. And this very much connects to the hedonistic aspect of utilitarianism. Consider the following famous passage from the utilitarian Jeremy Bentham. So he's talking about here what should draw the line of moral consideration or moral equality. He asks, is it the faculty of reason or perhaps the faculty of discourse or language? But a full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more rational and more conversable animal than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. Right? If you say that all beings with reason get to be treated well or get to be treated equally, then what do we do about, for instance, infants who certainly aren't born with the ability to have rational capacities? If we think infants matter, then how could we not say that dogs or horses matter when they, although not to the intelligence or rationality level of an adult human being, certainly are more rational than a very young infant that can hardly do anything for itself? So he says, no, the point is that it doesn't actually matter whether a being is rational or not. Here's the fundamental question. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? It doesn't matter that an animal can't reason to our level. It doesn't matter that an animal can't talk. Just like it doesn't matter that an infant can't reason to our level or that an infant can't talk. What matters is, can that individual suffer? And if an individual can suffer, then we need to take that suffering into account and we need to give it moral consideration. And that is because what makes a being's life go poorly is the presence of pain. It all goes back to the hedonistic aspect of utilitarianism. So I will stop there. Thank you for watching as always, and I'll see you in the next video.